This video is brought to you by Squarespace, the all-in-one platform where entrepreneurs can easily create and customize their own personal or professional website. More on Squarespace later in the video.
So hello and welcome to another episode of Geographics. I am your interim host, Karl Smallwood. No Eric today, it's me instead. The Karl with the small and then the wood. It's very funny, yes I know, let's move on. And today we are talking about Tiananmen Square, the beating heart of China. And it's normally at this point in the recording I like to point out these videos are by no means a solitary effort on my part. There are many people working behind the scenes to bring you content on Geographics, Biographics and Top 10s each and every day. And the person who touches the script first is of course the person who wrote it, who in today's case is Ben Adelman. Give them a follow on the social media links provided to us below. But let's get on with it, shall we? In many capital cities around the world, there are famous spaces designed for public gatherings that also house monuments and government buildings, acting as a sort of central point to showcase the power and glory of their particular nation. Washington DC has the National Mall, Paris has Champs-Élysées, London has Trafalgar Square, and Paris has the Pariser Platz. The counterpart in the Chinese capital of Beijing is no less grand, if perhaps less well known. Tiananmen Square. Originally envisioned during the days of the emperors as a market square, it has been enlarged and glorified by the ruling Chinese Communist Party into a showpiece location, the site of numerous civic ceremonies, monuments and memorials, as well as government buildings and museums, as well as the thing we know you're thinking in your head right now. We'll get to it, don't worry. Tiananmen Square has also traditionally served as the primary location for protests against the government, even before the communist takeover. This includes the infamous incident in 1989 that brought international attention to the square and to China as a whole, which is largely unknown within the confines of the country itself because of government censorship. Like a quite impressive, almost heroic amount of government censorship, to the point where this video will probably not be viewable in China. I don't know why I'm saying probably there, you can't watch this in China. So this history of protest, as much as the statues and grand buildings, lends credibility to Tiananmen Square, showing it not only as a location but as a symbol representing all of China and its people. When Zhu Di ascended to the throne of China in 1402 as the Yongle Emperor following a civil war, he made the decision to move the capital from Nanjing to the newly renamed city of Beijing, where he spent much of his adult life. He ordered the construction of a massive palace complex that would later become known as the Forbidden City. When completed in 1420, it would serve as the home of the emperors of China for well over 500 years. Surrounding the Forbidden City was the Imperial City, home to gardens, shrines and service areas, as well as providing residential spaces for high-ranking officials who weren't housed within the Forbidden City. You're probably wondering why is it called the Forbidden City? It's because, as you might expect, not many people were allowed to go there. So the entire imperial complex was separated from the rest of the city of Beijing by a large wall, as is Chinese tradition. Access was controlled through 7 gates, each of which had elaborate and awesome names, in keeping with the cultural Chinese conventions of the period. The Great Southern Gate in the imperial city was called the Tiananmen, usually translated as the Gate of Heavenly Peace. It was considered to be one of the main gates through which the distinguished visitors, high-ranking officials and the emperor himself accessed the palace complex, with the commoner traffic, including deliveries, relegated to the smaller side gates. The Tiananmen took on its present form in the 17th century when it was rebuilt following its early destruction in 1644 when Beijing was sacked by rebel general Li Zhizheng. The new gate was finished in 1651. The open area to the south it became known as Tiananmen Square. It was considerably smaller than its current present size, only taking up about 25% of its current area, with the rest taken up by a busy marketplace and residential buildings. Near the centre of the present-day Tiananmen Square stood the Great Qing Gate, which was ceremonial entrance to the imperial city, as opposed to the Tiananmen, which was a defensive fortification. The pathway between these two gates was called the Corridor of 1,000 Steps, because everyone except for the emperor and the empress was required to dismount from their horse or sedan chairs at the Great Qing Gate and walk into the imperial city. At this point, I'll note I have been to Tiananmen Square and seen the Imperial City and the Forbidden City and all that, the museums located therein. If the editor for this video wants pictures of that,
yes, please.
There's an especially funny one of me in front of the giant Mao portrait, which I guess we can show if you want me to show it when we get to the part where the giant Mao portrait is mentioned. So, moving on. On October 1st, 1949, Mao Zedong chose Tiananmen Square as the site to mark his victory over the nationalists in the Chinese Civil War, proclaiming the founding of the People's Republic of China in front of a large crowd, followed by a military parade. Ever since, October 1st has been celebrated as National Day in China, with events in Tiananmen Square being particularly elaborate, and you've probably seen the clips of that. They are pretty impressive. In the 1950s, Mao embarked on an ambitious project to dramatically expand the Tiananmen Square to turn it into the largest and most spectacular in the world, at least to quote him, capable of holding 500,000 people. The square was quadrupled in size, with any and all buildings in the way demolished to make way for it. This included the Great Qing Gate, renamed the Gate of China, following the overthrow of the last emperor in 1912. The centuries-old ceremonial structure was unceremoniously pulled down in 1954. The new square was ready in time for the celebrations surrounding the 10th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1959, with a large military parade on National Day that was designed to emulate the annual events in the Red Square in Moscow. The construction was designed to do more than simply expand the size of the square. It transformed the space into the centerpiece of, to quote, New China. At the southern end of the square, a war memorial called the Monument to the People's Heroes was erected, featuring a 10-story obelisk that is kept lit at all times, day and night. On the western edge of the square, the Great Hall of the People was built, one of the chief government buildings of the new nation, where meetings of the National People's Congress occur annually each March. On the eastern edge is a large museum building, today known as the National Museum of China. The Tiananmen, separated from the square by Chang'an Avenue, was left largely intact, although it did undergo a renovation in 1969, so extensive that no one is really sure how much of it is original and how much of it is reconstruction, especially because the whole project was a state secret. Two placards were attached to the gate, one reading, "Long live the People's Republic of China," and the other reading, "Long live the great unity of the world's peoples." In the centre of the gate, the most famous addition was added. A massive portrait of Mao weighing 1.5 metric tons, replaced annually prior to National Day. And if the editor wants to put it in, here is a candid photo of me in front of the giant Mao portrait. My friend refused to delete or take another one off, so yeah. Also, yeah, I did used to be that skinny. I ate one meal a day, and that was beans on toast, usually followed by vodka or whatever. So I'm sure whatever I was just talking about was very interesting, but it's time for a word from today's sponsor, Squarespace. Isn't that right, Snoot?
Yes, it is.
This is a bad idea. So I'm joined off camera by two members of our ad team, Brad and Nisha, to tell us more about today's sponsor, Squarespace. So Brad, tell me more about Squarespace.
Squarespace is a platform you can use to make your own website.
A website that makes websites. It's ingenious. It's like having a 3D printer that makes 3D printers.
How about we go through a step-by-step process on how easy it is to make a website?
Let's do that. That sounds fun.
So if you want to get started as quick as possible, you can go through one of their many templates and choose one that fits whatever you'd like to use your website for.
I love templates. Like, so I like to think I'm a creative person, but then I try and be creative. I'm like, you know what? I'd rather have someone do this for me.
But then if you'd like to take that step further, you can use the built-in Fluid engine to drag and drop anything you want into your website.
Wait, you tell me I can drag and I can drop? Like, look at that. Word hasn't figured that out yet, and that's existed for 15 years.
But then if you want to take it a step further,
to go
even further beyond...
I like how we all thought the same thing then. We're like, this is what it means to go further beyond website design.
You can add extensions to expand the functionality of the website to a level beyond anything even I can comprehend.
I'm just imagining now, you drag and drop just the Super Saiyan blue hair onto Goku. So thank you to today's sponsor, Squarespace. Head to squarespace.com for a free trial. When you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/geographics, and to save 10% on your first purchase of a website/domain, use the code Geographics. So as has become tradition, let's end this sponsor spot with a bonus fact not found anywhere else in this video. Guys, would you like to hear a fun fact about the moon landing?
Yay!
So the plan to erect an American flag on the moon wasn't actually part of the Apollo mission until about 3 weeks before the rocket took off, and while it's often assumed that the flag was specially made, it was actually bought from a store, specifically Sears, and the story goes that NASA sent out 3 interns to buy 3 different flags on their lunch break and then test to see which one worked. They all went to the same store and all brought back the same flag, the $5 one from Sears, so that's the one that went to the moon. Tiananmen Square's place as the cultural and symbolic heart of China has made it a centre of protest and conflict even before the communist takeover in 1949. In 1860, during the Second Opium War, British and French troops occupied Beijing, pitching their tents in front of the Tiananmen as a show of strength. They briefly considered burning down the gate and the Forbidden City itself to punish the Chinese government and force them to comply with their demands, chiefly the legalisation of the opium trade. But fortunately for world history, the British decided to instead merely loot and burn the old summer palace. The French, for the curious, refused to participate in the arson part. They were more than happy to just steal a bunch of stuff from China. After the Opium Wars, the legation quarter was set up just to the east of Tiananmen Square as a place to house foreign diplomats and other foreigners in Beijing, which had been up to that point closed to them. This quarter became the centre of a conflict in 1900 when a group called the Society of Righteous and Harmonious Fists, known to the West as the Boxers, because even though that name is cool as all hell, you don't want to be saying that every single time. They laid siege to it as part of their campaign to expel all of the, and I quote, foreign devils from China and end the system of control through trade ports that other countries have been imposing on China for decades. The Boxers, supported by the Dowager Empress and thus the Imperial Army, besieged the legation quarter for 55 days straight. In response, an alliance of 8 nations, Great Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Austria-Hungary, Russia, Japan and the United States, sent an army of 55,000 men into China to rescue the trapped diplomats. Only one of the 3 divisions charged with defending Beijing supported the Boxers, allowing the Allied army to occupy Beijing for well over a year. Conducting troops drilling manoeuvres in Tiananmen Square, atrocities were committed on both sides, with an estimated 100,000 people dying before the war ended in 1901, with the defeat of the Boxers and the Chinese government forced to pay a large indemnity to the Allies. The first mass protest in Tiananmen Square that we're aware of occurred in 1919 after the establishment of the Republic of China. Following the Allied victory in the First World War, Chinese commissioners to the treaty negotiations at Versailles pressed for the return of the Shandong Peninsula, which had been seized from Germany, to Chinese control. When it was instead given to Japan, it was viewed by many Chinese as just another example of foreigners unduly influencing their country in their way of life. Popular unrest resulted in mass protests not only in Tiananmen Square, but other cities across China, including Shanghai. Many young radicals who would go on to be leaders in the Chinese Communist Party were active in the May 4th movement, which culminated in China refusing to sign the Treaty of Versailles. So there have been 2 large-scale political demonstrations in Tiananmen Square since the communist takeover. One was eventually embraced by the Chinese Communist Party as a patriotic protest, the other subject to such strict censorship that hardly any Chinese people know about it, at least if they try and learn about it online. The first event occurred in 1976, a year of great transition within Chinese politics. Mao Zedong was still the head of the nation, but those around him all knew that his health was rapidly failing. A behind-the-scenes power struggle was taking place to determine who would succeed Mao. On one side were a group of hardliners known as the Group of Four, who wanted to continue Mao's cultural revolution in spite of the negative impact it was having on the Chinese economy and society. On the other side were more moderate politicians such as Premier Zhou Enlai and former Vice Premier Deng Xiaoping, who wanted to institute reforms. However, when Zhao died of bladder cancer in January 1976, it seemed that the Gang of Four, led by Mao's wife, Jiang Qing, had won, since Deng had fallen out of favour with Mao and was marginalised. However, Zhou was a popular figure in China, and his death was widely mourned all across the country. In an attempt to cut off support from the moderates, the Gang of Four severely restricted the usual period of public mourning. This backfired, and 3 months later, on April 4th, the start of the traditional Qingming Festival, when Chinese people pay homage to their departed ancestors, a crowd gathered around the War Memorial in Tiananmen Square and began laying wreaths and other tributes to Zhou at its base, giving the departed leader a send-off they felt he deserved but had been denied. Many of the mourners left signs criticising the Gang of Four for their treatment of Zhou, and some even dared to criticise Mao himself as well as the Cultural Revolution. The CCP Central Committee, in a show of force, cleared the monument of all the mourning items overnight. The next day, April 5th, a crowd of 100,000 people arrived in Tiananmen Square and, angered at finding the monument cleared, rioted. Police cars were set on fire, government buildings around the square were broken into and looted, and military police armed with clubs and leather straps were sent into the square to clear it by force. In In the aftermath of what became known as the Tiananmen incident, the Gang of Four labelled the protest as a counter-revolutionary activity and more than 40 people were arrested and jailed. However, 5 months later, Mao died, and within weeks, the rest of the Central Committee had turned on the Gang of Four, removing them from power in a bloodless coup. Deng Xiaoping would eventually emerge as the party's leader in 1976, and as part of his wide-ranging political and economic reforms, had the Tiananmen incident recategorised as a revolutionary moment. The protesters who would come to Tiananmen Square 13 years later would not be so lucky, however. So I guess we have to talk about that now. So Deng's economic reforms were designed to largely undo the damage to the country caused by the Cultural Revolution of Mao. His policy of Bolang Fanzheng focused on opening the closed Chinese economy, particularly its workforce, to foreign investment, as well as setting up special economic zones in cities like Shenzhen, where elements of the capitalist market economy were allowed to flourish. The country's GDP skyrocketed, but the increased national wealth wasn't being enjoyed by everyone. Corruption and nepotism among party bureaucrats was rife as they engaged in price gouging and hoarding of consumer goods to become rich at everybody else's expense. At the time, a new generation of young people, mainly concentrated in the country's universities, were pushing for reforms not to just the economy but to the political system itself. The sudden death of politician Hu Yaobang, who had been purged from leadership roles because of his liberal policies and ideas on April 15th in 1989, acted as something of a catalyst. Students began to gather in Tiananmen Square, initially mournful, then angry, the gatherings acting increasingly as a call for reform. Over the course of the following 6 weeks, more and more demonstrators came to Tiananmen Square, still led by students but now including people from all walks of life. They called for an end to press censorship, to reforms, to curtail political corruption and the freedom to demonstrate, among other things. Students began organising into groups that weren't controlled by the party apparatus, something that alarmed top leadership officials. In order to gain sympathy for their cause, the students began a hunger strike in the square, which was the scene of international media attention because of the impending state visit of Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev. The meeting, which was supposed to be a triumphant reconciliation of the world's two communist superpowers, was disrupted by the demonstrations, a humiliation in the eyes of the world that Deng Xiaoping wasn't going to stand for. He may have opened China's economy, but at its core, he was still a party man, a veteran of the Civil War and a firm believer in socialist principles. He decided that, one way or another, he was going to show the demonstrators who the boss was. You all knew this bit was coming. Be warned, gets kinda heavy. On May 20th, 1989, the Central Committee declared martial law. To enforce the crackdown, they called upon the People's Liberation Army. The army deployed an estimated 250,000 troops to Beijing, believed to be the largest military operation undertaken by the Chinese since the end of the Korean War in 1953. It was an overwhelming display of force designed to scare the demonstrators into submission, but it didn't work. Between 50 and 100,000 of them refused to disperse. Initial attempts to move troops into the capital were opposed by demonstrators, with violent clashes breaking out in some cases, but for the most part, things remained oddly peaceful. On May 24th, the army pulled back and the demonstrators celebrated what they thought was a great victory. It was beginning to look like a wave of revolutions that had swept through the Eastern Bloc countries throughout the 1980s was going to take hold in China too. But the Central Committee wasn't backing down. Quite the contrary. They called on additional troops. The soldiers underwent re-education by the Chinese Communist Party cadres in order to convince them that the situation at Tiananmen Square was an uprising that threatened the security of the country as a whole, and it needed to be suppressed at all costs. Two high-ranking members of a Central Committee who opposed the implementation of martial law were forced out of office. Officers who refused to obey their orders were removed from their commands and court-martialed. Any hint of disagreement with Deng's hardline policy was quickly snuffed out. On the night of June 3rd, the troops received their marching orders. They were to advance into central Beijing and clear the demonstrators out of Tiananmen Square by 6 a.m. the following morning. There were to be no delays, no stopping to negotiate, and the use of any and all force in order to achieve the mission was authorised. What happened next was as shocking as it was unsurprising. As the army advanced towards the square, they encountered large groups of demonstrators blocking their path. Attempting to force their way through, they were repelled by the students who threw rocks and bricks at them. The PLA had no troops who were trained in urban riot control, so they reacted to the resistance the way they were trained to, by opening fire with assault rifles. Hundreds of protesters and bystanders were killed. The automatic fire was indiscriminate, not simply targeting the violent protesters, They had rocks, not machine guns, but anyone who happened to be in the vicinity as well. The army used their tanks and APCs to smash through makeshift roadblocks in the streets, running over and crushing anyone unlucky enough to be in the way. Most of the protesters, shocked that they were being attacked with live ammunition, ran for their lives, although some fought back with whatever means they had available. About 24 PLA soldiers and police officers were killed in the fighting. However, the body count was always going to be lopsided, since almost none of the demonstrators had weapons. They had rocks, sticks, and placards. By the time it was over, the PLA was in control of Tiananmen Square, but it would take days for the army to take control of the entire city, as isolated clashes with pockets of demonstrators continued all over Beijing. The iconic image of the entire affair took place on June 5th, when a single man was photographed stubbornly blocking the path of a column of tanks who were driving down Chang'an Avenue. The man, who has never been positively identified, would go on to be dubbed Tank Man, and the image is one of the most famous photographs ever taken. He was last seen being hustled out of the way by an unknown group of people. There continues to be debates to this day about what happened to him. And for anyone curious, there are numerous stories about what happened to that guy. One is that it was a group of demonstrators who hurried him away, fearing for his life. The other is that he was taken away by the army and just immediately killed. We don't really know for sure. However, there is one interesting story about that guy's just act of protest. Because if you look at the photo, hopefully we can share it, because I know it is copyrighted and sometimes you get a copyright strike for using it, even though it's one of the most iconic, enduring images of the last 100 or so years. Is that you can see that he's holding a shopping bag. And there is a theory, because obviously interviews about people who survived Tiananmen Square are few and far between, but there are some reports that suggest he was just a guy. He was just a guy who was walking home, saw the tanks, and just in that moment decided, F this, and decided to stand in the way. Again, we don't know for sure because the guy's never been positively identified, but there are some interviews where they say he was just a guy going about his day who decided in that moment, I literally cannot stand for this, and stood in the way of an entire column of tanks. And somewhat ironically, the photo, which again I hope we can share, is censored over here in the West, because more often than not they use the cropped version, which shows one man in front of one tank. And there's the uncropped version is way more badass, because the uncropped version, which admittedly is a bit messier and harder to see what's going on, is one guy and it's 15 tanks. And it's one of those ironic things of attempts to make the image more iconic and enduring, actually diminish the gravity of the act that was being committed. But again, I could talk about this all day. We should probably move on. So the same aura of mystery that surrounds Tank Man also surrounds pretty much the entire crackdown. To this day, the Chinese government refuses to confirm how many people were killed. The only official death toll is 241, believed to be a quite significant undercount. How many were arrested and what happened to them in custody, with allegations of secret executions of tortures of prisoners being quite widespread and, let's be honest, quite believable. Despite efforts by the authorities to confiscate film and video taken of the operation, shocking footage nevertheless made it out to the rest of the world. China faced near universal condemnation for their actions, not only from Western countries, but also many Eastern Bloc countries as well, including the Soviet Union. The US and the European Union placed an arms embargo on China that persists to this very day. The event became known as the Tiananmen Square Massacre, despite the fact that almost none of the bloodshed actually happened within the square itself, but instead took place in other locations in and around Beijing. The Chinese government's reaction to the outcry was to simply ignore it. They accurately and depressingly predicted that international furor would die down eventually and people would just forget. They spent much more time and effort making sure that any and all information about the protests and the massacre would be almost impossible to access within China itself. The events of 1989 are near impossible to find anything about and are subject to strict censorship within China. Books that even remotely reference it are banned, and internet searches for it are blocked behind what is dubbed the Great Firewall. Chinese citizens can be arrested and imprisoned if they are caught disseminating information about it. And there's an author's note here I'm going to read in its entirety. This video is for sure going to be blocked in China, and all of us are most likely going to be put on a Chinese watch list for being associated with it. To any Chinese officials watching, hello? I was looking forward to visiting your country again, because I've visited China once before, and I will say, in all my years of travel, I've never encountered more hospitable and welcoming people than all the Chinese people I met while I was over there. It's a lovely, beautiful country filled with just some amazingly welcoming, friendly people. Just kind of sucks about all the censorship and the government running people over with tanks. Anywho, so as a result, 35 years later, most young people in China are completely unaware of the demonstrations and the crackdown. The CCP hasn't softened its stance with time, and it seems that unless the situation in China changes dramatically, we may never know the truth of what happened during those bloody days in Beijing. Tiananmen Square became much more heavily policed after 1989, with access to it barred altogether on major anniversary dates of the 1989 bloodshed. Starting in 2021, visitors need to make a reservation in advance in order to visit the square. Purportedly, this is because of a need to control crowds of tourists, but it also makes a similar mass demonstration as the one in 1989 quite unlikely. Still, it remains one of the most visited locations in all of China, particularly to the mausoleum of Mao Zedong, built and opened in the middle of Tiananmen Square in 1977, and for the elaborate flag-raising ceremony that occurs in the square each and every day at sunrise. Still, outside of China, Tiananmen Square continues to be indelibly associated with the 1989 massacre for many people. It is really the only thing they know about the location. Not exactly the image of a happy and prosperous China that Mao had in mind when he transformed it into a showpiece location all of those years ago. So I hope everyone at home found this video to be educational, informative, and entertaining. I certainly found it to be all three of those things, and if you are inclined to agree, author Ben Adelman can be found at the social media links provided to us below, so you can give them some props for that. And I'd like to say, if you like the video, leave a like, comment, feedback, suggestions, all that good stuff, and subscribe for more. As you've seen throughout this video, I have visited China and Tiananmen Square. It is a beautiful country full of friendly, welcoming people. It is kind of gutting that as a result of recording this video, I probably won't be able to go back, because I do know people who live there, who obviously I'm not going to name in case the people in China who are watching this to put me on some sort of list want to just be a to my friends. Well, that kind of sucks. It's a wonderful, beautiful country, and it's just, it's got its faults like all the rest. And it's like, yeah, I enjoyed my time over there, and it would have been nice to go back, but I guess that's not going to happen now. So, cheers.